So I don't know if you guys have heard, but former US officials are holding secret talks, or at least have held secret talks with Russian government officials. Most importantly, the foreign minister of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, the ghoul. They actually had private conversations, I believe back in April, once Sergei Lavrov came to New York in order to head the UN Security Council. Let's read a little bit about this, because these type of back-channel communications are a lot of times, that's how we got the Iran deal. That's how a lot of negotiations start. That's how a lot of peace deals start. So I do think it's important to listen to this, and I do think it's important to talk about making sure that the Ukraine is included in any back-channel negotiations. Let's talk about these secret negotiations. A group of former senior U.S. national security officials has held secret talks with prominent Russians believed to be close to the Kremlin, and at least in one case, with the country's top diplomat, with the aim of laying the groundwork for negotiations to end the war in Ukraine. Half a dozen people briefed on the discussion said. In a high-level example of the back-channel diplomacy taking place behind the scenes, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with members of the group for several hours in April in New York, four former officials told current U.S. four former officials and two current officials said. On the agenda were some of the thorniest issues in the war in Ukraine, like the fate of Russian-held territory that Ukraine may never be able to liberate, and the search for an elusive diplomatic off-ramp that could be tolerable to both sides. Meeting with Lavrov was Richard Haass, a former diplomat and outgoing president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Current and former officials said. The group was joined by Europe expert Charles Kupchin and Russia expert Thomas Graham, both former White House and State Department officials who are on the council, who are Council on Foreign Relations fellows. The former U.S. officials involved did not respond to requests for comment or declined to comment on the record. All of the sources declined to be named in order to confirm talks were intended to be. In order to confirm talks that were intended to keep. They stayed quiet. They have yet. They're not commenting because they don't want to confirm talks that were meant to be confidential. There we go. Among the goals, they said, is to keep channels of communication with Russia open, and when possible, to feel out where there might be room for further negotiation, compromise, and diplomacy over ending the war. The discussions have taken place with the knowledge of the Biden administration, but not, and this is important, but not at its direction. And former officials involved in the Lavrov meeting briefed the White House National Security Council afterwards, two of the sources said. The discussions are known in diplomatic parlance as Track 2 diplomacy, a form of unofficial engagement involving private citizens not in the government, or in this case of the Lavrov meeting, Track 1.5, meaning current officials are involved on one end of the conversation. Former high-level, by the way, I do think it does say something that the foreign, foreign secretary, Sergei Lavrov, the Gremlin, right, that he, even though he's a current Russian government official, he's the foreign minister of foreign affairs for the Russian Federation, he's meeting with non-government officials who are not even at the directive of the federal government to negotiate peace and talk peace. That does show that the Russians do want a way out. Now, let's continue. Formal high-level diplomatic engagements between the United States and the Russian government over Ukraine have been few and far between. It is not clear how frequently the back-channel discussions have taken place, nor whether they are part of a single organized effort. On the U.S. side, the discussions have involved some former Defense Department officials, including Mary Beth Long, a former Assistant Defense Secretary with deep experience in NATO issues, according to two people briefed on the talks. At least one former U.S. official has traveled to Russia for discussions involving the Ukraine war, two of the people said. Aside from Lavrov on the Russian side, the discussions have involved academics, leaders from major think tanks or research institutes, and others in the Russian foreign policy sphere perceived as having President Vladimir Putin's ear or as being in touch with Kremlin decision makers. The people declined to identify the Russian participants by name, citing concerns for their safety. A spokesman for the White House National Security Council declined to comment. The Russian embassy in Washington did not respond to a request for comment. An official of the office of the president of Ukraine said that it would not comment on specific news reports based on unnamed sources, but its overall position remained the same. Our position is unchanged. The fate of Ukraine cannot be decided without Ukraine. Many times the president and all our official speakers speak about it, not anonymously, but quite specifically publicly. Okay, so I will say that federal government officials have responded to this recently, and they have said, hey, you know, it's not at our directive. We did not tell these people to go out there and negotiate with Lavrov. These are private citizens working out a deal with the Russians on their own fruition. Maybe we'll agree with it, maybe we won't. They didn't say that last part, but you would assume this, that maybe they'll agree with it, maybe they won't. Whatever proposals are made, but it's happening. Not at their discretion, not at their direction, but independent of the federal government. So that's the first thing. Federal government does say that. Federal government also says that, and they agree with the Ukrainians on this, that if there are to be negotiations, the Ukrainians have to be at the table. And I also believe that if there are to be even back-channel negotiations that actually progress anywhere, the Ukrainians have to be involved. They have to be at the table. If there's going to be anything outside of back-channel type of open communications to make sure we're communicating, they have to be at the table once it starts to progress from anywhere. Because it is their country, they're determining their future, and there have been too many arrangements made in the history of the world, in the history of imperialism, where the people being imperialized, if we're going to use that word, I don't think that's a real world, but the people being imperialized, colonized, they're not at the negotiating table, their interests are not heard, and now it's just the great powers, quote unquote, that decide the future of the nation. Lay Slippers, thank you for gifting a tier 1 sub to Astros Likos. I appreciate all the love and support from everybody today and all the donations. I appreciate it. So I do want to just say, this is a good thing. This is positive. Even if the federal government didn't direct it, the fact that the Russian government and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, that's a high-ranking Russian government official, is willing to go out and talk to these non-government officials, not at the directive of the U.S. government, but these former government officials who are private citizens on the off chance that it might lead to an off-ramp. I think that's a good sign, number one, even if I think the odds of, in the near future, there being any progress or the Russians saying, okay, we'll leave Donetsk, we'll leave Luhansk, we'll leave Zaporozhye, we'll leave Kherson, we'll leave these areas. The odds of them doing that in the immediate future, I think, are low. I think, besides the fact that it's a good sign, it is very, very important. And this is something that a lot of people have been concerned about, me included to the same extent, but I wasn't ever as concerned as, say, I don't know, someone like Jimmy Dore or others, about the lack of communication between the federal government in Moscow and the federal government in the United States, considering they are the two largest nuclear powers in the world. And if the two largest nuclear power in the world aren't communicating, and not only are they not communicating, but they're engaged in a conflict, in a war, and the Russians invaded Ukraine, and we're sending weapons to the Ukrainians, we're sharing intelligence with the Ukrainians. If these two nuclear powers are grinding against one another, they have friction. We need to be sure to communicate about that friction. Even if they don't agree with what we're doing, we don't agree with what they're doing. If you're two largest nuclear powers on the planet, you should be communicating with each other. Because if something happens, let's say here's a scenario, and this has happened multiple times in the history of the world. People are standing near, the radar systems for our nuclear stockpile. They're of our aerospace control, and they say, oh my goodness, that looks like a Russian nuke. Did the Russians launch the nukes? If you have a clear line of communication, you can call. They'll say, Niet. You'll see nothing else come up on your radar, and you'll say, oh, it was an error, false alarm, don't worry about it. And there have been multiple false alarms in the history of these types of weapons. And have gotten very close, these false alarms, turning into actual nuclear war. So I think on a basic level, if there's anything we've learned from the Cold War, and specifically the 13 days during the Cuban Missile Crisis that the world stood on edge, is that clean and communication, or at least open channels communication, are extremely important for the safety and security of not only Ukraine, but the United States, Russia, and the rest of the world. So I do think, even if we're not going to make any progress on getting the Russians out of Ukraine through these negotiations in the immediate future, knowing that there are alternative channels of communication and channels of communications are always potentially open, and that the Russians will at least take those channels of communication so seriously that they'll even send their foreign minister to engage in those communications in New York, in the United States of all places. I think that's a good sign, and I think that's good for the world. The Turkey missile crisis, but yes, it's an interesting reframing.